A young lady arrives beneath gilded chandeliers and watchful eyes, promised to a widowed Viscount who can rescue her family's fading name. Yet across the assembly rooms stands the man her mother swears to hate, the Duke, whose silence once ruined a woman she loved. One warning slices through the music: do not speak to him, and the line is drawn. But secrets breathe in the shadows, and a past buried in shame rises to claim the present. Duty beckons, desire answers, and a single choice will set a heart and a city on edge. Tell me where you're listening from, and what do you love most about period romances? The scandal, the slow burn, or the second chances? Bath, England. The year is 1852. The morning mist clung gently to the honey-coloured stone of the Georgian facades, lending the air a softness that belied the sharp currents moving beneath society's polished surface. From the moment Zoe Harcourt's boots touched the cobbled edge of the Queen Square carriage stop, she felt it, the weight of purpose masked as civility, of ambition cloaked in lace and good manners. Her arrival had been orchestrated with precision. A modest but well-appointed lodging house had been secured on Brock Street, conveniently close to the pump room and the assembly rooms. Mrs. Clara Harcourt, ever draped in her dignified silks of widowhood, descended the carriage with the slow authority of a woman who remembered wealth and behaved as though it had never left her. Zoe followed, her gloved hands folded, her bonnet perfectly straight. She had been raised to walk with grace, to speak in measured tones, to pour tea with quiet elegance, and now to marry for salvation. Inside the pump room, the scent of mineral water hung in the air, mingled with rosewater and powdered hair. A string quartet played faintly from the alcove near the back, their bows rising and falling like murmured gossip. Zoe moved as her mother had taught her, with the precise confidence of a lady who knew she was being watched. And she was. The eyes of Bath's best-dressed matrons followed her every step, their gazes sharp behind feathered fans and mother-of-pearl lorgnettes. Her dove-grey walking dress, trimmed in white lace and paired with soft leather gloves, had been chosen not to impress, but to reassure, to suggest respectability, modest means, and an upbringing still untouched by desperation. She wore her late aunt's cameo at her throat, a subtle but deliberate signal of lineage. Her bonnet was trimmed with dried lavender and violets, carefully arranged by Mrs. Dunning before they'd departed London. They paused near the columned fountain, where widows and fortune hunters loitered alike, each sipping the warm, bitter water as if it might also restore reputations. A few ladies inclined their heads to Mrs. Harcourt. Most offered only cool glances to Zoe. She bore it with a soft half-smile, eyes downcast but unafraid. It was there that she saw him. He stood near the far window, half in shadow, facing the sun-dappled square beyond the glass. His silhouette was unmistakable, tall, straight-backed, dignified. Gabriel Wyndham, Duke of Ashbourne. The name still carried scandal like a trailing cloak. His presence was quiet but imposing, wrapped in a charcoal coat with a dark cravat knotted neatly beneath his collar. A silver-handled cane rested lightly in his right hand, though he did not lean upon it. His eyes, deep-set and unreadable from across the room, lifted only once, barely a glance, and yet Zoe felt it like a brush of wind against bare skin. Her mother's voice cut through the hum of conversation like a blade through satin. "You are not to speak to that man. Do you understand?" Zoe's gaze snapped back toward the fountain, but her heart, without permission, lingered by the window. "He is not to be acknowledged," Mrs. Harcourt continued, her voice low and urgent. "Not in this city. Not in any." Zoe said nothing. She had heard the stories, that he had seduced a gentlewoman and left her ruined, that his silence had been as damning as any confession, that he had once turned down an advantageous match to live in seclusion, surrounded by war veterans and working-class charity cases, all whispers, never confirmed, and yet even the hint of impropriety was enough to place a man beyond redemption in polite society, unless, of course, he held a dukedom. Then he was simply avoided. By the time the sun dipped behind the crescent and the gas lamps flickered to life, Bath had begun its evening transformation. Ladies emerged in silks and taffetas, their gloves pressed, their jewels glittering just enough. The Harcourts were no exception. Zoe descended the stairs of their lodgings in a periwinkle silk gown with a fitted bodice and a lace-trimmed Bertha neckline. Her hair had been styled into a low chignon, with soft curls brushing the nape of her neck. She wore the same cameo as before. Familiarity, her mother had insisted, bred comfort in others. The assembly rooms were alight with chandeliers and soft candle smoke, the music rising in delicate, hopeful waves. Conversations overlapped like satin layers, and laughter punctuated the air with measured delight. It was not joy, it was theatre. Zoe stood at her mother's side, her posture impeccable. Her name was whispered into the ears of those who mattered, those who would report it to Viscount Edgar Latham. And then he arrived. Latham cut a fine figure in midnight blue tails and a gold watch chain that caught the light as he moved. His eyes, ice blue, observant, swept the room before settling on Zoe. He bowed, not deeply, but with the precision of a man who had practiced elegance like swordplay. She curtsied, aware of every eye on her. He smiled. "Miss Harcourt, I trust you've found Bath to your liking." "It is charming, my lord," she replied softly, "though I find myself still discovering its corners. May I offer to show you a few?" It was a question wrapped in certainty. And yet, even as Zoe nodded, even as her mother beamed, and the musicians struck up another waltz, her eyes wandered toward the shadows at the edge of the ballroom. There, beneath a sconce half extinguished, stood the Duke of Ashbourne. He was watching, not her, not anyone in particular, and yet somehow everything. His face remained unreadable, though something flickered in the set of his jaw, the tilt of his head. He did not approach. He did not bow. He simply turned and disappeared into the corridor beyond, leaving behind only the echo of a gaze and the echo of something else. Something unspoken. And just like that, the line had been drawn. The morning after the assembly rooms unfolded with quiet elegance, as the mist receded from the slate rooftops and the streets of Bath stirred to life. A light breeze carried the scent of damp stone and lavender from the terraced gardens along Great Pulteney Street, where ladies in pastel walking dresses strolled under the watchful gaze of their chaperones. Carriages clattered gently over the cobbles, and shopkeepers opened their doors with slow, deliberate motions, aware that the season had begun and that every bow, every smile, every whispered greeting might reach the ears of someone powerful. Inside their lodgings, Mrs. Clara Harcourt sat by the window with a shawl drawn tightly over her shoulders, observing the passing world with the practiced eye of a woman who had once belonged to its centre. The newspapers had not yet mentioned Zoe's name, but that did not matter. In Bath, reputations were spun not by ink, but by whispers. "You must wear the lilac silk today," Mrs. Harcourt said without turning. "It lends a softness to your complexion. Viscount Latham is expected at the charity musicale. We shall be seated prominently." Zoe, seated at her dressing table, gave no protest. Her eyes rested on the cameo at her neck, her aunt's likeness worn like a talisman. The lilac dress awaited her on the folding screen, a gown of demure charm, with lace at the cuffs and a modest neckline edged in white ribbon. It was beautiful in a way that did not call attention to itself, precisely what her mother intended. That afternoon, the hall of the Widows' Relief Society was transformed. Chairs were lined in perfect rows, the scent of beeswax polish still clinging to the wooden floors. A harp stood at the centre beside a violinist tuning her strings, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The charitable musicale was one of Bath's gentler rituals, music given for the benefit of the unfortunate, and reputations brokered in the silences between notes. Zoe entered beside her mother, her posture impeccable, her expression composed. The eyes of the room, as always, found her, not with scandal, but with expectation. Edgar Latham stood near the hearth, conversing in low tones with the rector's wife. He turned at once when he saw Zoe, his smile blooming with unspoken possession. "Miss Harcourt," he greeted, bowing low. "Your arrival has improved the tone of the room considerably." "You are kind, my lord," Zoe said, dipping a curtsy. "I am honest," he replied, offering his arm. "May I escort you to your seat?" Mrs. Harcourt gave a slight nod, and Zoe allowed herself to be led. Latham's charm was precise. He spoke of art, of his acquaintance with the Earl of Cowes, of how philanthropy had become a passion of his late wife. He made no mention of the assembly rooms, nor of the man who had disappeared into the corridor as Zoe danced with someone else. But there was something in his tone, something carefully measured, as if each compliment was weighed for effect. Zoe responded with the expected grace, yet her mind wandered. As the musicians took their place and the crowd settled into reverent silence, Zoe allowed her gaze to drift. And there, near the side door, partly concealed by the velvet drapery, stood the Duke of Ashbourne. He did not sit, he did not mingle. He stood alone, his figure dark and immobile, the light from the arched windows falling across one side of his face. A thin white scar traced the left edge of his temple, catching the sun like a faded ribbon. His hands were clasped behind his back, and he leaned just slightly on a silver-handled cane. His expression was unreadable, yet Zoe could feel the tension that hung around him like an unspoken word. Their eyes met, only for an instant. It was not bold. It was not scandalous. It was something quieter, something far more dangerous. Zoe turned away, her pulse suddenly quick beneath her gloves. The music began. Throughout the performance, Latham leaned close to whisper praise of the musicians, anecdotes from London, and occasional observations meant to remind Zoe of his connections. She answered politely, but each word from his lips felt increasingly like a weight placed gently but firmly upon her shoulders. It was not until the final applause that Zoe saw Ashbourne move. He made no show of departure. He simply slipped through the side door, unnoticed by all but her. Later in the courtyard, as guests took refreshment beneath the budding branches of the magnolia trees, Zoe found herself momentarily alone. She stepped toward the shade of a low wall, her fingers brushing the cool stone. "I hope the music pleased you." She turned. He was there. Gabriel Wyndham stood a few paces away, his hat in his hand, his voice quiet but not tentative. His coat was impeccably cut, though well worn at the edges. The faintest trace of fatigue darkened the shadows beneath his eyes. "It did," she said softly. "It was lovely. You did not seem entirely present." Zoe hesitated. "Perhaps not." A pause. "I did not intend to disturb you," he added. "You did not." Her voice caught slightly, and she steadied it. "You merely stood too near the music." He inclined his head slightly, a ghost of a smile passing his lips. "I have grown used to listening without entering the room." She studied him then, not as society had described him, but as he was before her, tall, composed, reserved. A man with scars he did not advertise, who neither sought redemption nor flinched from the weight of his past. "Your Grace," she began, but he interrupted gently. "I believe we are not to speak." Zoe's breath stilled. "So I've been told." His eyes held hers, steady as iron. "Then let us say that we never spoke, and that the silence said everything." He bowed then, not theatrically but with gravity, and stepped back. She watched him disappear once more, each step measured, each movement controlled. The cane clicked softly against the flagstones, and then he was gone. "Zoe." She turned quickly. Mrs. Dunning stood at the garden's edge, her expression calm but knowing. "You saw," Zoe said. "I did." "Say nothing." Mrs. Dunning's eyes softened. She approached, taking Zoe's arm as they walked slowly beneath the flowering boughs. "There are many ways a man can control a woman," the widow said gently, "some with fury, some with flattery, and some with silence. But never forget Zoe looked up, her lips parting. "A man who tells you how to speak," Mrs. Dunning finished, "will one day tell you when to be silent." The words settled between them, warm and heavy. Zoe said nothing, but something inside her, something tightly held, began to shift. That evening, the lamps of Bath glowed like distant stars reflected in puddles left by the afternoon rain. Inside the Harcourt parlour, Mrs. Clara Harcourt praised the musicale's success and spoke of Latham's manners with open delight. Zoe nodded at the appropriate moments, her hands resting in her lap, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on the scar that caught the sun, on the voice that spoke without intrusion, on the look that had held no demand, no judgment, only recognition, and on the silence that had said everything. The third morning in Bath broke with a sky of pewter grey, the clouds heavy with promise of rain. A hush seemed to settle over the city, as if even the air had grown cautious, listening, waiting. Inside the Harcourt lodgings, Zoe sat alone in the morning parlour, her gloves folded neatly beside her, her needlework untouched on her lap. She had tried to focus on the hem of a handkerchief, but the thread refused to follow her will. Her mind wandered, restless, uncertain, and no stitch could tame it. The knock came lightly, as it always did, followed by the housemaid entering with a tray. On it rested a crystal vase, brimming with pale roses, edged in blush. Zoe's heart skipped, not because of the flowers, but because of what lay beside them, an envelope, unsealed. There was no card, no name, no sender's mark, only her name written in a hand that attempted elegance but lacked refinement. The handwriting curled with elaborate flourishes, as if each letter had been written with an audience in mind. The paper itself bore the softness of something aged, its corners slightly curled, its hue tinged with the yellowing of time. Zoe lifted it with cautious fingers. Inside, folded twice, was a single sheet of paper, its ink faded, its message cold. "It was the Duke of Ashbourne who caused your aunt's fall. Ask no questions. The truth is not as silent as it seems." No signature, no context. Only that cruel sentence, sharp as glass. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she simply stared at the words, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She rose, carrying the letter as if it might burn her skin. The weight of it seemed heavier than paper should be. Downstairs, Mrs. Harcourt was already seated at the breakfast table, perusing the social column of the Bath Gazette. A silver spoon rested in her tea, untouched. Zoe stood beside her. This came with the flowers. Her mother glanced up, her gaze flitting to the envelope. At once, her expression darkened. She took the letter from Zoe's hands and read it silently, her face growing taut with each line. "I knew this would happen," she whispered. "We should never have come here." "But what does it mean?" Zoe asked, her voice low, brittle. Mrs. Harcourt folded the letter with precise movements. "It means you are to stay far away from the Duke. Entirely. There are matters best left buried, Zoe." "But if it's false, if," her mother's voice rose, "you think this is new to me. Your aunt's name was dragged through parlours and dining halls for weeks, and now some cowardly note confirms what we already know. He was involved, he always was, and if he was not, he never defended her." Zoe stepped back, her thoughts a flurry of doubt. "And if he stayed silent to protect someone?" Mrs. Harcourt's mouth thinned. "Then he is either a villain or a fool, and neither should be near you." Zoe left the room without speaking. Her feet led her instinctively to the home of Mrs. Dunning, whose front door bore a carved brass knocker shaped like an olive branch. The windows looked out over the Crescent Gardens, their panes fogged by the change in weather. She was let in at once. Mrs. Dunning, seated in her modest library beside a stack of sewing kits and folded correspondence, took the letter without a word. She unfolded it, examined the paper, the ink, the curl of the handwriting. Her brow furrowed. "This is meant to look old," she murmured. "But look here, the watermark, see that emblem? That paper was manufactured in London no earlier than 1849. It cannot be older than 3 years." Zoe leaned closer. The evidence was there, subtle but irrefutable. "And this flourish," Mrs. Dunning continued, pointing to the exaggerated H in Harcourt. "It is oddly familiar. I've seen that same curve in another hand this week." Zoe blinked. Then it came to her. Latham. In his note of apology for being late to the musicale, he wrote my name almost the same way. Mrs. Dunning looked up sharply. "Are you certain?" Zoe nodded. "Then this was not meant to inform you," the widow said, her voice turning steely. "It was meant to frighten you, to push you into retreat. The flowers, the dramatic touch of no sender. It's a staged performance." Zoe's heart pounded. "But why? Why now?" "Because you looked at Ashbourne," Mrs. Dunning said simply, "and someone noticed." Rain had begun to fall as Zoe made her way back through the city, her bonnet drawn low, her gloves damp. Bath, with all its golden stone and elegant order, had never felt more like a cage. The streets were filled with open parasols, quick steps, and lowered gazes, and still she could not shake the feeling that eyes were following her. That evening she sat before her mirror, her reflection pale and unsure. She recalled the way Ashbourne had looked at her, steady, unflinching, without false charm or demand, a man who carried a weight he did not try to explain, a man whose silence had felt heavier than words. And yet, the letter existed. Could it be true? Could a man who had spoken to her with such calm, such quiet understanding, have once brought ruin upon a gentlewoman? Her fingers trembled as she removed her earrings, each movement mechanical. In the hallway beyond, her mother's voice floated through the closed door, speaking with determined urgency to a guest she could not see. Zoe opened the drawer of her vanity. She placed the letter inside, closed it, and turned the key. The next morning the directive was clear. Zoe was to attend no event where the Duke of Ashbourne might be present. If he entered a room, she was to leave it. If he spoke, she was not to answer. Any further association would be interpreted as impropriety. And impropriety, in their current social position, was death. Zoe listened, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, her face composed. But inside, something had cracked, not in fury, nor even in grief, but in suspicion. The seed had been planted. If the truth was not as silent as it seemed, then who had silenced it? As the carriage rolled toward Laura Place for a midday tea, Zoe pressed her hand to the glass, watching the drizzle paint rivers on the pane. She thought of her aunt, now nearly a decade gone, of her laughter once musical and free, of the hollow way her name had been erased from conversation as if she had never been, and she thought of Ashbourne's gaze, the way it had seen her, not as a debutante or a solution, but simply as a person. Some lies wore velvet gloves, and some truths had sharp edges, hidden beneath bouquets of roses. Zoe closed her eyes and let the silence speak. The following week unfolded beneath skies the color of old pearls, soft, veiled, and watchful. Rain did not fall, but neither did the sun prevail. Bath seemed suspended in a hush, as though the city itself was waiting for something to break through the heavy stillness of the season. Zoe Harcourt moved through its polished parlors and carefully composed drawing rooms with the precision of a woman who had been trained to carry herself like porcelain, poised, unblemished, and always conscious of the hands that held her. Viscount Edgar Latham's attentions had become a steady drumbeat in her daily existence. He appeared with calculated frequency, a brief morning visit bearing news from the Gazette, a formal invitation hand-delivered before luncheon, a carriage ride arranged with the quiet authority of someone who assumed consent before it was granted. At first, the gestures had appeared thoughtful. He praised her restraint, her diction, her taste in literature. He quoted poetry without flourish and remarked upon her capacity for silent dignity. To those around her, Zoe was being gently pursued by a man of power, widowed too young, seeking a wife not for frivolity, but for the dignity of companionship and influence. And yet, Zoe had begun to feel her world shrink, one word at a time. When she mentioned the Women's Relief Circle hosted by Mrs. Dunning, the seamstresses and widows who met in the back room of the Unitarian chapel to sew garments for the poor, Latham had smiled gently. "Charity," he said, "is admirable in theory, but often poorly executed. You would do better to align yourself with causes of better pedigree." She had not responded, but the comment stayed with her, as did the way he had corrected the way she held her teacup at the Whitcombs' gathering, murmuring, "Just a touch more refined, Miss Harcourt," within earshot of a duchess's daughter. The changes came not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet shaping of her time. Her walks were rescheduled. Invitations were accepted or declined on her behalf. Her silence was rewarded, her questions carefully redirected. It was at the textile relief event held in the courtyard of St. Margaret's Hall that the fragile rhythm broke. The day was overcast, the kind that turned stone to silver. Women stood beneath white awnings, assembling kits of linen and wool for workers' families affected by a mill fire on the city's edge. There was talk of a small boy burned by boiling dye water, of his mother's screams, of the factory's silence. Zoe was distributing fabric beside Mrs. Dunning when the commotion began. A child, barely more than 4, darted between the carriages, chasing a scrap of ribbon caught in the wind. A delivery cart, drawn by a skittish mare, clattered around the corner too fast. Shouts rang out. The boy froze. And then, suddenly, a figure burst forward. Zoe saw only the long, dark coat first, a flash of movement sharper than all others. Gabriel Wyndham, Duke of Ashbourne, lunged into the path of the oncoming cart, his cane cast aside, his body low and braced. He snatched the boy into his arms and pivoted just as the wheel scraped past his heel. The driver hauled the reins, the cart veering and jerking to a halt, its cargo tipping dangerously. Silence fell. Ashbourne knelt in the road, the child pressed to his chest, his breathing tight and measured. The boy wailed, a healthy sound, full of life, and clung to the Duke's neck. Blood trickled from Ashbourne's palm where a splinter of the cart had caught him. He said nothing. He simply rose, steadied the child, and returned him to his mother, whose sobs shook the street. Only then did he retrieve his cane, his limp more pronounced now, though he hid it with practiced dignity. Zoe had not moved. Her breath caught somewhere between ribs and reason. The others resumed their tasks, brushing off the incident as an unfortunate flurry. But Zoe had seen it. The speed, the instinct, the quiet after. Ashbourne never looked at her, not once. That evening, after much persuasion, Zoe returned to St. Margaret's with Mrs. Dunning under the pretense of checking supply lists. The courtyard was nearly empty. Ashbourne stood beneath the awning, helping the staff close crates. His coat was draped over a chair, his sleeves rolled back, revealing the dressing on his injured hand. He saw her approach, but made no motion to intercept her. She stood before him, her voice a whisper. "You could have been killed." He tilted his head. It was a child. "I know," she said, "but most men would have shouted, waited for someone else to act. I didn't do it for you to see." Those words, so simple, so achingly unpolished, unsettled her more than any praise might have. He looked at her then, not with intensity, but with stillness. There was no need to raise his voice. Everything in him spoke already. Zoe dropped her gaze, her breath uneven. "I hope your injury heals swiftly," she murmured. "It will." Silence grew thick between them, not uncomfortable, but charged. The air trembled with words unspoken, with questions neither dared ask. At last, she nodded and turned away. As she walked beside Mrs. Dunning toward the carriage, her gloves clasped tightly in her hands, Zoe felt as though the walls of her carefully arranged life had shifted a few inches outward, and she had suddenly remembered how to breathe. The next morning, Viscount Latham arrived with a bouquet of orchids, white, imported, extravagant. He praised Zoe's charitable efforts, though he had not attended the event himself. He spoke of marriage, of future connections, of a home in Belgrave Square where she might host refined gatherings. Zoe responded with soft civility, but her eyes wandered to the window, where raindrops streaked the glass like tears. Later that day, her mother read aloud from a letter detailing the guest list for an upcoming garden party. "You shall wear the blue silk," Mrs. Harcourt said, "and keep near the Lathams. They've offered you every courtesy. It's time you did the same." Zoe nodded, but the words pressed against her like velvet chains. The gown, the orchids, the compliments, they were all part of a design, a careful, beautiful trap. And though she had not spoken the words aloud, her soul began to whisper them in defiance. "I am not porcelain. I am not to be arranged." And the man who saw the child before he saw the crowd had never once asked her to be less. The rain had passed, leaving the stone of Bath glistening as though the city itself had been polished by sorrow. Morning light slipped through the high windows of the Harcourt lodgings, pale and trembling, as if uncertain it had permission to enter. Zoe stood before the mirror in her room, her hands resting on the small table, her breath shallow. Her reflection stared back with more resolve than she felt, yet it was there, nonetheless. A footman arrived shortly after the clock struck 10. He bore no seal, no crest, only an envelope of simple cream paper. Inside was a note, handwritten in a style she recognized at once. Precise, elegant, and entirely devoid of vanity. "Miss Harcourt, if you would allow me 10 minutes of your time, I shall be walking the eastern colonnade at 11. I shall not linger beyond that hour. With full respect, Gabriel Wyndham." The note bore no embellishments, no expectation, just the quiet dignity of a man unaccustomed to asking for time, and yet asking all the same. Zoe did not hesitate. She did not seek her mother's approval, nor consult with Mrs. Dunning. She simply dressed with care, choosing a slate blue walking gown with a modest collar and fitted sleeves. Her gloves were unadorned, her bonnet fastened with a single grey ribbon. She pinned her aunt's cameo beneath her throat, not as a symbol, but as a shield. By the time she reached the colonnade, the wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the trees along the edge of the square. Stone columns lined the path in solemn rows, casting long shadows that danced and retreated as clouds shifted overhead. It was a public place, and yet, in that hour, it felt set apart from the world, as though time had paused to listen. He was there, waiting near the central arch. No one stood beside him, and yet he did not appear alone. The air around him carried weight. Unspoken truths, regrets unburdened, the gravity of a life lived in silence. Gabriel Wyndham removed his hat when she approached. His coat was dark, his posture straight, despite the ever-present stiffness in his gait. His expression bore the same calm restraint she had come to recognize, not coldness, but a deliberate gentleness, forged in a crucible far older than vanity. "Miss Harcourt," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." She inclined her head. "You asked with courtesy. I could not refuse that." A faint smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. "I have never been a man of many explanations. Most of the time, I have found that people prefer their version of events. And yet, you summoned me. Because I sense that you are not like most people." He gestured toward the far end of the colonnade, where the wind softened and the sun slanted through the columns in streaks of gold. They walked together slowly, their footsteps muffled by the flagstones beneath their feet. "I assume," he began, "you received the letter." Zoe glanced at him. "I did. I imagine it said nothing new. It said enough to raise questions. And questions, I've found, often lead to truths no one wishes to speak aloud." He was silent for a moment. Then, with a sigh, he continued. "Years ago, before your aunt left London for Bath, she came to me with a request. A young couple she had taken under her protection, friends of a family fallen into disgrace, had become entangled in a scandal, the sort that ruins names, closes doors, and marks a woman for the rest of her days." Zoe's steps slowed. "She asked if I could intervene," he said, "discreetly. Their families would disown them. The man's prospects would vanish. The woman's reputation had already begun to fray. "And you?" she asked, voice low. "I stepped forward," he replied. "I allowed the story to bend toward me. I let them believe it was I who had taken liberties, who had acted without honor. I did not protest when your aunt's name was dragged with mine." I remained silent. Zoe stopped walking. The sunlight fell across her bonnet, casting a warm glow on her face. "Why?" He looked at her then, and something deep within his eyes shifted, something unguarded, vulnerable. "Because their survival mattered more than my name," he said simply. "And because your aunt asked me." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, of ache, of 100 words never spoken. "She always spoke of you," Zoe whispered, "but never in bitterness, only in sorrow." He nodded. "She carried more grace than any woman I've known. She paid the price for another's safety and never sought to reclaim her place." Zoe's throat tightened. "You never told the truth?" "No one wanted it," he said. "Not then. Not now. People prefer a villain with a title. It makes the gossip easier to swallow." They stood in stillness, the columns around them like sentinels. He did not reach for her. He did not beg belief. He merely offered her the gift of truth. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "You didn't owe me this." "I didn't offer it because I owed it," he replied. "I offered it because I believe you deserve to decide for yourself what is true." She bowed her head slightly, overwhelmed not by drama, but by the purity of that act. When she looked up, he had stepped back. "I will not disturb you again," he said. "This was all I had to give." And with that, he turned, limping slightly, and walked away, his figure receding into light and shadow until he disappeared beyond the columns. Later that day, Zoe sat in the small library of Mrs. Dunning's home, the faint scent of old books and camphor balm lingering in the air. The widow listened in silence as Zoe recounted the encounter, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. When Zoe finished, Mrs. Dunning opened a drawer in her writing desk and retrieved a folded pamphlet. "This was published 8 years ago," she said, "the same year the scandal broke." Zoe unfolded the paper. It was a printed ledger from the Bath Veterans Aid Society. At the bottom of the donation list, one name stood alone, anonymous, but with a listed address that Zoe now recognized. "He funded the hospice?" she asked softly. Mrs. Dunning nodded. "Quietly, he saved that home from closing. It houses 23 men and 2 nurses now. No one ever traced the gift back to him." Zoe held the paper in trembling hands. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was a pattern, subtle, deliberate, consistent. A man choosing silence where others chose spectacle. A man who did not need to be believed to continue doing what was right. That evening, beneath the dim glow of the candle in her writing chamber, Zoe pulled out her notebook and began to trace the edges of the scandal. Guest registries, delivery records, subscription lists. She remembered the forged letter, the one that had arrived with the roses, and how its seal had seemed oddly familiar. The thought led her to the library on Queen Square. There, beneath layers of dust and careful record-keeping, she found it. A document signed by Viscount Edgar Latham. His signature was impeccable. His seal, pressed beside it, was the same generic stamp used on the letter meant to destroy Ashbourne. Zoe stared at the page, her breath catching. The truth had always been there, hidden in plain sight, and now she would no longer close her eyes. The lanterns outside the Harcourt's lodgings burned low with the coming dusk, casting amber light against the damp stone walls. Evening in Bath wrapped itself in stillness, the kind that muffled sound and amplified secrets. Zoe stood by the hearth in the drawing room, the note in her hand trembling slightly as she read it again and again. Not for its words, but for the absence of them. The seal. That was what mattered. Pressed into the wax was the same indistinct emblem she had seen days before, on the anonymous letter that condemned Ashbourne and sullied her aunt's name. A seal meant to appear neutral, forgettable. But now she had found it again, pressed into a document in Viscount Latham's own hand. The forgery was no longer a suspicion. It was certainty. She waited until the evening gathering at the Montreux residence, a charitable affair meant to raise funds for the restoration of a country chapel. Mrs. Harcourt had insisted on attending, armed with the confidence of a mother who believed her daughter's engagement was imminent and therefore secure. Zoe wore a dark violet silk dress with velvet ribbon at the sleeves and bodice, striking but solemn, chosen without consultation. The drawing room of the Montreux house glittered with chandeliers and low voices. Conversation drifted like perfume, and music from a pianoforte echoed softly along the corridor. Latham arrived late, as he often did, his entrance timed to be noticed. He greeted the room with ease, pausing for compliments, pressing gloved hands in subdued affection. When he spotted Zoe, his smile broadened. She returned it only faintly. A quarter of an hour passed before she found him alone, near a window framed in heavy drapes, the moonlight touching the edge of his jaw. She approached without preamble, her voice low and controlled. "I visited the circulating library yesterday." He turned toward her, untroubled. "And did you enjoy your reading, Miss Harcourt?" "I found something," she continued, "among the records. A letter bearing the same seal used on the message sent to me last week. The seal you used on a land grant 2 seasons ago, filed under your name." He did not blink. Her voice grew softer, sharper. "Do you intend to deny it?" Latham's expression did not harden. It did not twist. It merely settled into something quieter, flatter, more dangerous. "No," he said, "I don't." The words struck her like ice. "You forged a letter to destroy another man's reputation," she said, barely breathing. "To frighten me, to control my choices." His smile returned, thin and without charm. "You are clever, but a woman in your position cannot afford to be clever, not publicly." Zoe stepped back, but he followed with a single, calculated pace. "You are no longer wealthy," he continued, voice smooth as silk drawn across glass. "You are admired, yes, but admiration fades quickly when it is not fed. And scandal, real or invented, will leave you with nothing." She stared at him. "You were never courting me. You were grooming me. I was protecting you from your own illusions," he answered, his eyes cool. "Ashbourne is a ruined man, a shadow with a title. He has nothing to offer you but whispers. I offered you protection, a future, respect." "You offered me silence," she said, and turned to leave, but his hand closed around her wrist before she could step away. It was not violent. Not quite. But it was firm, too firm, and it held her in place with an authority that did not belong to any man outside a battlefield. Zoe gasped, low and quick. She tried to pull back, but he tightened his hold, his voice now a low hiss. "Your independence," he said, "is not what I need in a wife." Her eyes flashed, her voice trembling but fierce. "Then I am not the wife you need." The moment broke when the sound of footsteps approached. Someone rounded the corner with quiet ease, and Latham released her at once. It was Ashbourne. He did not speak. He did not demand. He merely stopped, took in the scene, the line of Zoe's shoulders, the way her hand rested slightly behind her, red at the wrist. His gaze flicked briefly to Latham, who had already recovered his polished stance. Then Ashbourne stepped forward with the kind of stillness that carried weight, and from his coat pocket he withdrew a white handkerchief. He held it out without a word. Zoe hesitated for a moment, long enough to feel her shame catch fire, then took it with slow, deliberate fingers. Her hand brushed his. That single moment of contact spoke more than any warning could. Ashbourne bowed his head slightly, then turned and walked away. Latham had not moved. Zoe said nothing more. She left the gathering with her mother shortly after. Mrs. Harcourt noticed nothing, only that Zoe's face was paler than usual and that she did not speak during the ride home. She interpreted this as modest reflection on the attention she had received. By the time they arrived at the lodgings, she was already drafting a list of guests for a formal announcement. In the drawing room, under the flicker of candlelight, Zoe unpinned her gloves. and sat in silence. Mrs. Harcourt stood at the mantel, arms crossed. "You are to be engaged within the fortnight," she said. "The Viscount has offered every assurance. The date must be set before gossip interrupts what we have worked for." Zoe raised her head. "There is no we, Mother. You worked for this." Mrs. Harcourt turned sharply. "You would throw away everything for a man with no standing, for someone the world has already forgotten?" "No," Zoe said softly. "I would throw it away for myself." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "That is the most selfish thing I've ever heard you say." Zoe stood. "Then perhaps you've never truly listened." She left the room then, her steps echoing down the hall. In her chamber, she sat at the writing desk and stared at the handkerchief Ashbourne had given her. It was plain white linen, clean, folded neatly. A gentleman's handkerchief. No crest, no initials, just kindness. Her wrist ached slightly, and she lifted her sleeve to reveal the bruise forming beneath the skin. Not dark, not yet, but it would deepen. She traced it with her fingers and felt something within her steal into place. The mask had fallen, not his, hers, and she would not wear it again. The night had not lifted. Dawn trembled at the edge of the horizon, uncertain, shivering behind the low mist that curled over the rooftops of Bath. The streets were quiet, damp with dew, their silence broken only by the faint creak of wooden wheels or the distant cry of a coalman beginning his route. Wrapped in her wool cloak, Zoe Harcourt stepped out before the clock struck 6, her breath rising in soft clouds before her. She did not wake her mother. She left no note. She took nothing with her except the truth she could no longer carry in silence and the memory of a bruise still fading on her wrist. The convalescent hospital stood on the outskirts of the city, just beyond the elegant crescents and manicured gardens. It was a modest building of pale stone, weather-worn and dignified. The scent of chimney smoke lingered faintly in the morning air, mingled with the sharp sting of vinegar used to scrub the floors. Its windows glowed softly with lamplight. Someone within had already risen. Zoe hesitated at the gate, glancing up at the tall shape of the main hall, her heart steady but heavy. She had come without invitation, but she knew he would be there. Gabriel Wyndham had always chosen silence over spectacle, service over sympathy. And it was precisely in places like this, where broken bodies and quiet dignity coexisted, that he could most easily disappear from the eyes of the world. She stepped inside. The hall was warm, lit by a few oil lamps along the corridor. A faint groan echoed from somewhere distant, followed by the quiet, rhythmic clinking of glass against metal. Zoe followed the sound to a room near the end of the passage, where pale morning light spilled through the frosted window. He was there. Gabriel stood beside a bed, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, tending to an elderly veteran whose leg had been poorly set in the field and still ached with each change in temperature. He spoke softly to the man, adjusting the blankets, his movements precise and gentle. Zoe watched in silence until the man drifted into half-sleep. Only then did she step forward. He turned, and for a moment neither spoke. His eyes widened just slightly at the sight of her, so early, so out of place, her face pale and earnest beneath the hood of her cloak. "Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice quiet and grave, like the wind before a storm. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," she answered, "everything." He guided her toward a small side room, sparse but warm, with a kettle steaming gently in the corner. There was a single chair, a table, and no pretense of comfort, only usefulness. Zoe stood, unwilling to sit, her hands clasped before her. "I came because I have no more room for lies," she said. He did not interrupt. He watched her with the patience of a man who had stood at gravesides and heard confessions with no expectation of absolution. She told him everything: the letter, the seal, the orchids, the bruising grip near the balcony, the warning spoken like a threat, the way Latham had looked at her, as if she were a piece to be placed and held. She spoke of the forged accusation, of the cold correction, of the world shrinking around her each day. She remained silent. Only when she finished did she raise her eyes to his. "You told me once that you bore the blame for others," she said. "But now I know who it was you were protecting, not yourself, not even my aunt, someone else entirely." Gabriel's gaze did not waver. He nodded once. "She was young," he said softly, "and desperate. Her name was Margaret Wells then. Now she's Margaret Elstone, head matron here." Zoe's breath caught. "She works here." "For the past 6 years," he confirmed. "It was your aunt who saved her from ruin. She pleaded with me to help shield the couple when the scandal began to fester, and I did, without protest, because it was never about me. Why didn't you ever speak?" He looked down for a moment, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "Because your aunt asked me not to. Because Margaret had a child and her husband was about to begin a post in the north. If word had gotten out, they would have lost everything. I had the title. I had the luxury of silence, and I have never once regretted it." Tears welled in Zoe's eyes, not of sorrow, but of something deeper. The grief that comes from finally understanding how much had been sacrificed for the sake of appearance. "All this time," she whispered, "we carried shame that wasn't ours, that never belonged to us." He met her gaze again, and in that look was not sorrow but resolve, the kind born from years of quiet conviction. "She was one of many who deserved better," he said, "and if silence was the price of her peace, I would pay it again." Zoe stepped back then, her heart pounding. The weight she had carried, the shadow over her aunt's memory, the whispered stain on her family, had been lifted not by revelation, but by the steady light of truth. Truth that had never sought a stage. "I don't know what the world will do with this," she said quietly, "but I know what I must." When she returned home, the morning light had fully arrived. Bath had awakened in full, carriages passing, children running, shopkeepers calling out to early patrons, and in the Harcourt parlour, Mrs. Clara Harcourt stood by the fireplace, clutching a sealed envelope in her hand. "The Lathams are requesting a date," she said. "They expect an announcement this week." Zoe removed her gloves slowly, calmly. "There will be no announcement," she said. Her mother froze. "What nonsense is this?" "I will not marry Edgar Latham," Zoe replied, her voice composed but unshakable. "I will not marry a man who tries to break others to keep them obedient." Mrs. Harcourt paled. "You are jeopardizing everything. You will destroy what little we have left. I would rather have nothing than live as someone I'm not." Mrs. Harcourt's lips parted in protest, but no words came. Her knees buckled, and she would have collapsed had it not been for the swift arm of Mrs. Dunning, who had arrived moments before and now stood beside her, bracing her with surprising strength. Mrs. Dunning guided her gently to the settee, her voice soft but steady. "Perhaps," she said, "you raised her better than you think." The silence that followed was filled with more than shock. It was filled with the birth of something new, a woman stepping fully into herself, a mother confronting the limits of her ambition, and a household that had for too long traded its truth for social survival. Later, Zoe sat alone in her room, the dawn's light now gold against the glass. Her fingers rested on the edge of her desk, beside the folded handkerchief Ashbourne had once offered her. It bore no crest, no initials, only the memory of a man who had stood beside her, not to rescue, but to witness. She did not know what would come next, but she knew with absolute clarity that it would be chosen by her. The first true warmth of spring had crept into the air, but Zoe Harcourt felt none of it. In parlours and tea-rooms, in lace-trimmed corners of drawing-rooms scented with orange blossom and scandal, her name drifted like perfume gone sour, not shouted no, but whispered, repeated in low voices behind fans, embroidered with lies and polished with innuendo. She refused him. After all that, she embarrassed her mother. "I heard she struck him." "No, worse, she spoke back. Uninvited from luncheons, left off guest lists, eyes averted in the Crescent Gardens where once greetings had flowed freely, Zoe found herself slowly erased, not violently but carefully, like chalk smudged from a slate. Society was not cruel in overt ways. It was cruel in its refusal to acknowledge you had ever belonged. And still, she stood. Each day she walked through the streets with her spine straight and her eyes steady, dressed plainly but with purpose. Her gloves were clean, her bonnet tied without vanity, and her presence declared something wordless but unmistakable. You will not silence me. At the convalescent hospital, she delivered fabric herself, stayed to mend, to read, to listen. She spoke with Margaret Elstone, the woman once hidden behind her aunt's disgrace, and learned the shape of a life rebuilt on quiet courage. In that small, austere office where the ledgers were kept and tea was boiled on an iron stove, Zoe made a decision. She would not reclaim her name through whispers. She would reclaim it with facts, with records, with truth. And so, over the course of a single determined week, Zoe organized a formal gathering under the pretense of transparency. The Widows' Relief Society was overdue for a financial review, and the Seamstresses' Circle, long dismissed as a sentimental project for unwed ladies, would show what it had truly accomplished. Invitations were written in her own hand and delivered to patrons of influence, respected matrons, military widows, merchants' wives, and a few titled women known for their fairness. They came out of curiosity at first, some out of pity, and a few because beneath the layers of gossip there lingered a flicker of admiration. The event was held in the assembly hall adjacent to the chapel on Walcott Street. It was not elegant. The floors creaked, the pews had been moved aside to make room for trestle tables. But sunlight poured through tall windows, warming the ledger books spread open, the charts, the fabric samples neatly labelled with the names of recipients. Zoe stood at the head of the room, flanked by Mrs. Dunning and Margaret Elstone. She wore no jewels, no embroidery, only a dove-grey gown with a high collar and her aunt's brooch pinned at the centre of her throat. Her voice, when she began to speak, was quiet, but each syllable carried weight. She presented the records, accounts of donations, itemized receipts, supplier names, and stitching ledgers with the initials of every woman paid for her work. She read aloud testimonials from recipients, widows, orphans, factory girls, whose names would never appear in society papers, but whose survival had been sown by those now dismissed as idle ladies. There was stillness in the room, and then, calmly, she laid down the final document, a facsimile of the anonymous letter she had received, accusing the Duke of Ashbourne of dishonour, bearing no signature, no seal, and beside it, a public registry. A property transfer dated 3 years prior, filed by Viscount Edgar Latham, bearing the same wax seal. Identical in shape, texture, and absence of identifying mark. Zoe spoke plainly. She did not accuse with heat. She offered what could be seen, touched, compared. This, she said, was meant to frighten me into silence, to steer me away from a man who refused to control me, and toward one who required obedience to grant protection. There was no cry of outrage, only a long-waited pause. And then, from the back of the room, a figure stepped forward, Margaret Elstone. She said nothing. She merely nodded once, her chin lifted in the stillness. A silent act, a witness no longer hidden. In that moment, the lie cracked open. Edgar Latham stood among the crowd, his composure immaculate, his hands gloved, his smile polite. But the mask, once secure, no longer held. A ripple of doubt passed through the room like wind through high grass. Eyes turned, not toward Zoe, but toward him. And still, he said nothing, not a word. His silence, once his strength, became his condemnation. He left before the meeting ended. No formal farewell, no defense, only absence. Later that evening, Bath buzzed not with scandal, but with unease. Some clung to disbelief, others remained cautious. But many, more than Zoe dared to hope, began to ask the right questions. Mrs. Dunning sat beside her that night, beneath the gaslight in the parlour of the modest home where Zoe now spent her evenings away from scrutiny. She poured tea and watched her with eyes warm but alert. "You did not shout," she said. "No," Zoe replied. "I had no need to. You let him collapse under the weight of his own construction." Zoe nodded. "He built it too high. He thought no one would dare push." Mrs. Dunning smiled faintly. "And so he fell." Zoe leaned back, her shoulders aching, her breath slow. She was tired, bone-tired, but there was something else beneath it. Relief. Not the kind that came with victory, but the kind that came with truth told in daylight. Her fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, where the bruises had faded but not vanished. She traced the skin and thought not of shame, but of resolve. Outside, spring continued to bloom. The air was changing. So was she. For the first time in years, Zoe Harcourt no longer waited for approval to speak. She had spoken, and the world, whether it listened or not, had heard her. The soft, persistent knock at the side entrance of Mrs. Dunning's modest stone home came just as the fire in the drawing room had begun to settle into its evening lull. Outside, dusk had painted the bath rooftops in muted tones of rose and pewter, and the gas lamps along the lane flickered to life, one by one, like watchful sentinels. Zoe stood from her embroidery with a stillness that surprised even herself. The weight of days past, of judgment, exile, exposure, should have left her brittle. Instead, she moved with something close to calm. She opened the door before Mrs. Dunning could rise from her chair. He stood there, without a hat, coat unbuttoned, the chill settling into the folds of his dark frock. His face bore no urgency, only a quiet, measured gravity. Gabriel Wyndham, Duke of Ashbourne, did not bow. He inclined his head, as one might before an equal. In his hands was no bouquet, no silver box, no symbol of possession. Only a modestly wrapped parcel tied with pale twine. "For you," he said simply. Zoe stepped aside to let him in. The light behind her caught the edges of his profile, the faint scar near his temple, the lines etched gently into the corners of his mouth by silence, more than age. He walked with his cane, though less heavily than before, as if his burden had shifted to something no longer physical. In the drawing room, he placed the parcel on the table between them and removed the twine with slow precision. Beneath the paper was a worn leather volume, The Pilgrim's Progress, annotated in fine, looping script. Inside the front cover, a name Zoe had not read in years bloomed in familiar ink. Agnes Harcourt, her aunt's book, her marginalia. Her pressed violet, now delicate and faded, but miraculously intact. Zoe's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the gentle ache of recognition. "I found it among a stack of donations at the hospital," Ashbourne said. "It had been misplaced, years ago. When I opened it, I knew it belonged with you." Zoe traced the edge of the page with her fingertips. She read this aloud to me. "On evenings when my mother was in London, when everything felt—" She looked up, the emotion forming a knot in her throat. "She said we all walk through valleys, but we must never mistake the valley for the end of the path." Ashbourne met her gaze. "Your aunt was a woman of extraordinary strength. She paid dearly for her mercy." Zoe closed the book gently and lifted her eyes. "And you bore the cost with her." There was a pause, filled not with discomfort, but with understanding. "I didn't come to ask for your hand," he said at last. "That would presume you owed me something. You do not." Zoe said nothing. "I came to ask," he continued, voice steady, "if I might walk beside you. Not ahead, not behind, simply beside." For a moment, there was no sound but the crackle of the fire and the faint murmur of the street beyond the shuttered windows. Zoe stood. She stepped closer, not with haste, not with theatricality, but with purpose. "I won't be owned," she said, "not even in affection." His lips curved, not in triumph, but in respect. "I would not dare try." She extended her hand. He took it, not to lift, not to kiss, but to hold, as one would hold something sacred, not because it was fragile, but because it mattered. And so it began. Not a courtship of possession, but of restoration. They sat by the fire a little longer. Mrs. Dunning returned briefly with a tea tray, and upon seeing them said nothing, only offered a knowing smile and set down the china with the care of someone who had waited a long time for this moment to arrive. Ashbourne did not linger. He left as the street lamps were being trimmed, and the first stars slipped silently into the sky. When Zoe returned upstairs to her modest room, still holding the book, she found her mother waiting. Clara Harcourt sat in the armchair by the window, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, hands folded in her lap. Her face was pale, thinner than it had been in London, with a tightness at the corners of her mouth that had long served as a shield. But tonight it had softened. "I remember when Agnes read that to you," Clara murmured. "I thought it filled your head with nonsense. I wanted you to focus on proper French, not pilgrims and allegories." Zoe smiled faintly, setting the book on the side table. "You never said so." "I didn't say many things." Her mother's voice cracked. She pressed her fingertips together, then looked up. "There was a time I wanted to paint, before I married your father, before I knew the cost of being a woman with hopes." Zoe's heart paused. Her mother had never spoken this way, not of dreams, only of expectations. "I gave it up," Clara said, her voice quieter now. "One must give things up, Zoe. That's what I was taught." "But not everyone should," Zoe replied gently. Clara looked at her daughter for a long moment. "You're stronger than I was, and I was so afraid that would ruin you. I see now it might be what saves you." She rose with care and kissed Zoe's forehead, a rare, quiet gesture that held no instruction, no demand, only a kind of surrender. "I'll let you rest," Clara said. "Tomorrow is yours." When she had gone, Zoe sat on the edge of the bed and opened the book once more. The violet rested between the pages, as if time had bowed around it. She thought of the choices that had led to this night, of the lies that had crumbled, the truth that had survived, the dignity that had cost so much and still endured. She was not rescued. She was not rewarded. She was simply free. And in that freedom, something beautiful had begun. Not a fairy tale, but a life. Outside, Bath slumbered beneath the watchful stars. But within one modest room, lit by the faint glow of embers and memory, a new story quietly unfolded. Not in declarations, not in vows, but in the simple unspoken promise of two hands reaching, meeting, and remaining. Spring settled over Bath with a gentleness that felt earned. After so many months of silence, storm, and whispered judgments, the city seemed to inhale once more, filling its lungs with sunlight, jasmine, and the golden hush of renewal. Blossoms burst along the royal crescent, and the River Avon shimmered under skies that no longer threatened rain. On a bright morning thick with the perfume of lilacs and laundered linens, the pump room stirred earlier than usual. Patrons gathered not out of habit, but anticipation. Whispers circled like ribbons around the colonnades, twisting through the columns and catching on the hems of silk skirts and walking coats. She came without fanfare. Zoe Harcourt stepped into the light of late morning, not in morning grey or the icy blue of debutantes, but in periwinkle silk that shimmered subtly with each breath of wind. Her gown bore no frills, no trains designed to sweep or silence, only a graceful cut that moved as she moved. The brooch that had once belonged to her aunt lay pinned at her collar, gleaming softly like a memory honoured and held. She wore no veil. Her hair was simply arranged, and her gloved hand rested calmly on the arm of the man beside her, the Duke of Ashbourne. The room fell quiet, not from scandal, but reverence. It was not the hush of disapproval that had once followed them, but the stillness that comes when something long awaited, quietly doubted, finally takes form. Ashbourne offered no bow nor boast. He stood at Zoe's side like a man who knew his place at last, not before her, not behind her, but beside. They did not speak much during the visit, nor need to. A few women offered polite smiles. One elderly gentleman inclined his head with a glint of memory in his eye. As they passed the musicians, the cellist gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The world, it seemed, had chosen to remember differently. Later that afternoon, in the sun-warmed chapel of St. Swithin's, far from London invitations and embroidered gossip, the ceremony took place. The pews were not full, but those who came mattered. Mrs. Dunning arrived early, dressed in a lavender pelisse, and seated herself proudly in the front row. Margaret Elstone came too, now serving as matron of the convalescent hospital, her presence silent but eloquent. And Clara Harcourt, though she had not voiced consent in words, wore a lace shawl Zoe had once mended for her and carried a sprig of rosemary in hand, a symbol of remembrance and perhaps of letting go. The officiant spoke simply. No lofty sermon, no elaborate sermonizing. Just two people who had already endured their vows in silence and sacrifice, now choosing to make them known. Zoe's voice did not tremble. Ashbourne's hand did not waver. When they turned to face the small gathering, the applause was not loud, but it rang with meaning. Afterward, there was no grand reception. Instead, they hosted a quiet gathering in the garden of Mrs. Dunning's home, where lemon cake was served alongside spiced tea, and the breeze carried the scent of daffodils and new beginnings. At a small table set beneath a climbing rose, Ashbourne offered Zoe a glass of elderflower cordial, poured with deliberate care. "Are you certain?" he murmured as he leaned close. "This is the path you wish?" Zoe took the glass, but her eyes remained on his. "I chose it long before you asked," she replied. "This is not a rescue. It is a return." He nodded, his lips barely curving. "This time," he said, voice low and steady, "I will let the world speak." Zoe's smile was quiet but certain. "Let it speak. I am not afraid anymore." In the days that followed, their presence together in Bath became less novelty and more expectation. Ashbourne was seen accompanying Zoe to the expanded seamstress school, whose new wing bore no plaque with his name, only a simple sign above the door, the Harcourt Wing. Within, girls and women stitched not only garments, but futures. Zoe stood at the head of each class, instructing in both skill and dignity, always reminding them that silence was never a price they had to pay again. Mrs. Harcourt began appearing as well, at first with stiff posture and guarded glances, but soon with her sleeves rolled and her hands occupied, hemming garments, sorting bolts of fabric, and teaching French to those who asked. She never spoke of Latham again, nor of society's invitations which no longer arrived. In their place came something unexpected: peace. One afternoon, weeks after the wedding, Zoe found her mother seated beneath the open window, mending a torn cuff with neat practice stitches. "Did you ever think," Clara said, not looking up, "that I might still be useful?" Zoe set a cup of tea beside her. "I think you were always waiting to be needed differently." Clara gave a soft, brittle laugh. "Your aunt would be insufferably pleased." "She would," Zoe agreed. That evening, Ashbourne came home with a parcel under his arm, an ink-stained notebook containing notes from the Veterans' Hospice. He placed it on the desk beside hers and kissed the side of her head without a word. They worked into the quiet hours, content in the harmony of shared purpose. They did not need to declare their love in every room they entered. They wore it in their posture, their pause, their gaze across a crowded space, in the way his fingers brushed the small of her back as they crossed the street, in the way she refilled his tea before he asked. In the silence that once bound them, they had found something else, not fairy tale, not perfection, but truth, worn gently like a well-loved page, creased at the corners, marked in ink, cherished. And so the Duke who waited did not stand above her, nor behind. He stood beside. As Zoe Harcourt, now Zoe Wyndham, walked forward into a world that had once doubted her, a woman born not of rebellion, but of quiet revolution. And she did not tremble, not now. She walked through spring like someone who had finally arrived. Bath, 1860. The city had changed, but not too much. The colonnade still stood, polished by time and footsteps. The steam still curled from the pump room's sacred springs, and the cobbled street still echoed with the click of parasols and the turn of carriage wheels. But in the air, something was different. A softness had settled over the city, like linen bleached clean and hung to dry in summer sun. On a quiet afternoon in early autumn, a woman crossed Pulteney Bridge with a child's hand in hers. Zoe Wyndham no longer moved as someone awaiting permission. Her gait was certain, but unhurried. Her hat, wide-brimmed and trimmed with soft plum ribbon, shaded eyes that had seen too much to remain innocent and not enough to be bitter. Her dress was of modest wool, worn with grace, and her gloves bore small stitches, hand-repaired by choice, not necessity. Beside her walked a boy of 5 years, golden-haired and determined, his nose smudged with ink from the letter he had tried to write that morning. In his other hand, he clutched a book far too large for his satchel, The Pilgrim's Progress, dog-eared and loved. They turned on to Abbey Green, where the seamstress school had outgrown its original wing. Now it stood tall and bright, with students from widows' charities, veterans' families, and local parishes, a mosaic of those once overlooked. The sign above the door still read, "The Harcourt Wing," though now it was framed by wisteria and pride. Inside, Mrs. Clara Harcourt taught French every Tuesday morning. She was greyer now, a little slower, but no less formidable in posture. The girls adored her not because she had softened, but because she had transformed. Her story, the woman who once feared change, who now embraced it, was taught beside grammar and stitching. In the back office, Zoe's desk overflowed with correspondence, letters from women who had started their own shops, requests from hospitals needing patterns for patient gowns, notes of gratitude, stories of hope, each sealed with ribbon, some with wax, a few with clumsy flowers pressed inside. And beside her name on every official letterhead in matching ink and size was another. Gabriel Wyndham, Duke of Ashbourne. He no longer limped, or rather, he no longer hid that he did. His cane remained, but more out of habit than need. The weight he had once carried in silence now served as foundation. His dignity was no longer somber, it had acquired a wryness, a warmth. At the hospital he trained younger doctors and read aloud to convalescent soldiers, always choosing the same book, the one that had stitched so many fates together. At home he was father and husband, roles he wore not as titles but as truths. Their second child, a girl of 3, had Clara's eyes and her Aunt Agnes's stubbornness. She had already decided she would never marry unless the man let her keep her paintbrushes. Zoe sometimes sat in the garden with her daughter asleep on her lap, sunlight sliding through the trees, and wondered how much of her old self would recognize this life. Would the young woman who had once trembled beneath her mother's rules understand the quiet contentment that now filled her lungs? Would she believe it could come without surrendering the fire within? Perhaps not. And yet, that was the beauty of it. The fire had not been extinguished. It had simply been given shelter. As for Edgar Latham, his name had vanished from social calendars. He had retreated to a country estate purchased under the name of a cousin. Rumours surfaced now and again about business failures, a ruined engagement, a letter traced to a political blackmail case. But no one mentioned him in polite company. Time had not vindicated him, nor punished him theatrically. Instead, it had erased his influence the way morning light dissolves mist, without violence, but with certainty. Mrs. Dunning, now in her 70s, no longer climbed stairs without help, but she still hosted Thursday tea. Her cane leaned beside Zoe's at every visit. When asked once if she regretted never marrying, she had laughed and said, "I was too busy trying to convince women not to marry the wrong men." She and Zoe often walked together near the Royal Crescent, watching young couples stroll as they once had, wondering which would brave the truth of love and which would settle for its appearance. On the anniversary of Agnes Harcourt's passing, Zoe read aloud from her aunt's annotated copy of The Pilgrim's Progress, her voice carrying into the still air of the chapel's garden, where a modest plaque now rested among the rosemary and violet. And every year on that same day, Ashbourne would come with a single bloom, never more than one, and place it beneath the stone. He would not speak. Zoe did not ask him to, for some debts are not to be repaid, only honoured. As twilight fell over Bath, the Wyndham household gathered near the hearth, the children curled on the rug, Gabriel polishing a brass lamp with quiet satisfaction, Zoe leafing through ledgers, smiling softly at a letter from a girl in Yorkshire who had opened her own tailoring shop. And then, as the fire settled into amber light, Zoe looked up. Gabriel's gaze was already waiting, not possessive, not seeking, just present, as it had been, as it would remain. For love, when forged not in fantasy but in truth, does not weaken with time. It becomes time's companion, and so their story, written in silence and scar, laughter and ink, loss and renewal, did not end. It simply continued, softly, deeply, without fear. What if the courage to begin again was the most radical act of love? Zoe Harcourt's journey wasn't one of grand speeches or perfect endings. It was one of quiet rebellion, of choosing truth over comfort, dignity over appearances, and love that stood side by side rather than love that demanded surrender. Through silences, stares, and small acts of defiance, she carved a life of her own making, proving that even in the most rigid of worlds, transformation is possible when we dare to ask, "Who do I want to be, truly?" This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come in applause or public victories. Sometimes it arrives as a pressed violet in a forgotten book, a whispered apology at the edge of night, or the steady hand of someone who sees all that we are and still stays. If Zoe's story touched something in you, if you saw your own strength reflected in hers, we would be honored to know. Write the word Violet in the comments to let us know you stayed with us until the very end. Your presence here means more than you know. If you'd like to support the team that brings these period romances to life, you can leave a super thanks in the amount you feel comfortable with. Every contribution, no matter how small, is a thread in the fabric that keeps these stories alive. And if now isn't the time to give financially, sharing this story with someone who loves emotional, elegant storytelling is another beautiful way to help us continue. The more hearts we reach, the more stories we can tell. Don't forget to check out the other romantic tales I've left linked in the cards, stories filled with passion, redemption, and characters you won't soon forget. Thank you, truly, for being part of this story.